association here based in Seattle, but has members all over the United States. And they're members who are foundations, nonprofits, academic institutions, and private companies who are all working in low and middle income countries to improve lives on a variety of different topics. So this event today is actually part of a series of events that we're doing in the past few months, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and this one in particular is focused on life below water. And this event, alongside numerous other events, will cover all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then it'll all roll into a national conference that Global Washington is holding on December 7th and 8th. We'll tell you more about that later. This model is based on a concept out of Rockefeller Foundation and Brookings, based on the 17 rooms, again, for experts to come together and dive in deep on each of the SDGs. And then at the conference, we'll be looking at all the cross-cutting issues, because we know that these issues are very complex and there can't be just one solution. You need to take a comprehensive view. So at our national conference, we'll be looking at a lot of the cross-cutting elements that are fundamental to achieving all of the SDGs. And this year, as everyone knows, 2020 has been extremely challenging. With COVID in particular, there's been incredible setbacks to the SDGs. And also with the calls for racial equality here in the United States, it's really forced people to take a pause and rethink how they do their work. So here at Global Washington, we're really looking at reimagining how we all do global development and really looking at an equity lens, because this is a unique opportunity for all of us to reimagine how to do our work better. We want to build back, but we don't want to build back to the status quo of the way things were even a year ago. We have an opportunity to really leapfrog into something better. So I am thrilled to have this conversation today with these experts. And I'm going to do just a brief introduction. We'll have a panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A with all of you. Again, there's some social media hashtags if you want to use social media during this. Engage in the conversation through chat. Introduce yourself. You can always put comments and post other resources in the chat. And then when we go to Q&A, we're going to be using the tab at the bottom of your screen for Q&A. Please type in a question there and start thinking about your questions, but please hold off for about 45 minutes before you start typing in your question, because the panelists might address your issue in the meantime. So once we get to the Q&A portion, I'll be verbally asking those questions of the panelists, and they'll verbally answer to everyone. So let me introduce the panelists briefly. You should have received their full bios in the confirmation for this, but again, I'm thrilled to have, and we have people representing from Vancouver, BC, all the way down to Hawaii. So it's great for you all to be here. First, we have Andre Cisnero Montemayor, who's the Deputy Director at the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Program. And he's also a Research Associate at the University of British Columbia. So Andres is a resource economist, and he specializes in marine systems and cross-scale development policy. And he's involved in the dynamics between commercial, recreational, social, and cultural benefits within a complex ecological system. So Andres, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Next, we have Marah Hardt, who's the Director of Discovery at Future of Fish. And she's a scientist, an author, and a storyteller for sustainable future for people and the sea. She's also a founder of Ocean Inc., which is investigating coral reefs, ocean acidification, and fishery impacts. She previously worked at the Blue Ocean Institute, where she launched a climate change program. And I thought it was very interesting that she actually brought together scientists and religious leaders to really talk about climate change. Thank you for being here, Marah.
Thanks so much for having me. Nice to see you all.
Great. Our third panelist is Julie Kuchepatov. Is that right? Kuchepatov, who is the founder of SAGE, which stands for the Seafood and Gender Equality. Most recently, Julie was at Fairtrade USA, where she built a seafood program there to really look at the impacts of seafood producers and workers in Latin America, Southeast Asia, East Africa, and in the United States. And prior to Fairtrade USA, she spent 2 decades working in the Russian fisheries to improve their environmental performance at the Wild Salmon Center. And she was also a founding member of Ocean Outcomes, or O2. And when she was in Russia, she began her career with the Russian salmon industry. And she was part of a team running one of the most successful Atlantic salmon sport fishing lodges for 13 years in the Russian Arctic. So incredible experience. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So we're going to get started with the conversation, and I wanted each of you to start by telling us, within the context of your work and your organization, can you define the environment in the sense of working on sustainability issues, environmental sustainability issues, and how that intersects with economic forces for ocean-dependent communities, especially when you think about Indigenous communities who are most dependent on the ocean for their livelihoods. So Julie, let's start with you. Can you talk a little bit about your work and the intersection between economic forces and environmental sustainability?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So I started SAGE I guess SAGE is about 2 months old now, so it's a relatively new initiative. And, you obviously said a little bit about my bio, but up until, the sustainable seafood movement, which is kind of a subset of the environmental movement, is really only about 20 years old. And so the majority of that time we spent really looking at improving the environmental sustainability of fisheries and fish farms, and just global seafood production in general. And it's really evolved. So since around 6 or 7 years, we've started to take a closer look at social issues such as human rights violations and slavery and child labor, workplace safety. So it's really evolving. And so SAGE is really kind of, in my mind, it mirrors the evolution, my personal journey going from environmental to social to now more specifically around gender equality and global seafood production, as well as like how the sustainable seafood movement is evolving as well. And I think it's important that we are now understanding the intersections between environmental, social, and economic. And, I'll throw out the statistic that, small scale fisheries make up 90% of capture fisheries, workers. And so we can't not take people into account and their economic well-being while we're trying to look at how to kind of build back better fisheries and small scale fisheries specifically. And I can talk more about SAGE later.
That's great. Thank you for introducing that concept. Marah, I want to go to you as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you're approaching this issue between environmental sustainability and economic forces?
Yeah, I can. And again, thanks so much for having me. And Julie, that was an excellent sort of setup in the sense that I can build off of what Julie was saying. So just as a framing, at Future of Fish, we were an international nonprofit, but we focus on small scale fisheries and looking to create that economic viability, environmental sustainability, and socially responsible or greater equity. So this is very core to what we do. And a big rationale for that, as Julie said, is, the overfishing problem is a people problem. It's not a fish problem, right? And so we have to incorporate, and truly at Future Fish, we take an approach that is very human-centered design in our focus. And the fact is we know that you cannot ask for behavior change, whether it's to benefit the environment, whether to benefit social practices. You can't ask for that if folks do not have basic needs met, and if certain capacities are not in place at the individual and community level. So at Future of Fish, we have a fishery development model that we've been refining over the last, I'd say, 5 years or so. And the idea there is to look at really 3 pillars. And we look at building resilience and opportunity at the individual and community level, so that those individuals have the capacity to participate more effectively in their local seafood trade. We then also look at the seafood and markets, supply chain and markets. So as we're building up that capacity, we want local organizations and sort of anchor firms, entities in the supply chain that truly share the value of the resource back with those communities, that we can create greater equity. And then we're also looking at a systems level, how can we create the platforms, the collaborations, the multi-stakeholder endeavors that can really move things like traceability and better data within governments or the supply chain, that can also help with unlocking some of the blockages around financial access and the ability to get small scale fisheries to be able to really benefit economically, socially, and environmentally from using the natural resource. So as Julie said, this idea of really looking at an integrated and sort of systems approach, and I think actually in an earlier conversation, Julie, you said holistic, right? And that's necessary because, and we can talk about this more too, but for such a long time, and it was, I think, important, seafood work, sustainable seafood work, looked just at the fish or the fishery. Mm-hmm. And we were not even really plugged into solutions in food systems. We're not, and we're certainly not looking or haven't looked as widely as I think we can in terms of how we can embed some of this work in other types of activities and initiatives that could really start to gain traction, especially when it comes to the small scale sector. So I'll pause there.
That's great. No, really important. I didn't quite realize how fragmented this whole process is. So I'm really looking forward to learning more. Andres, can you tell us from your perspective how, especially with your background as a resource economist, how do you think about these issues?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, a lot of the things that Marah and that Julie were saying really resonate with the stuff that we're doing, right? With Ocean Nexus, we're definitely academic, we're a research institution and partnership. But I think nowadays, I don't want to speak for every scientist, but I think certainly for most ocean scientists, that recognition of the complexity and the linkages that we just have to recognize because they're there between the economics and the ecology, and also sort of the wider cultural and social values that are part of fisheries and really any ocean activity. And we've tried to bring that into research, right? And so to give you an example, again, with Ocean Nexus, we have, dozens of partners around the world. And there's people who are experts in oceanography and economics and ecology, biology. But even though they're very accomplished academics, one of our driving set of motivators is that building understanding isn't enough, right? So even though we all believe in science, we believe in data and the power of data and the usefulness of it in informing a lot of these policies, at the end of the day, what we really need, and I think someone already said it, is a transformation of the way we do these systems. Just a total change in the way that we relate to and that we understand the relationship between people in oceans. And I think I feel always very lucky to be facing these very big challenges, but with so many people around the world, including some people in this call, that really are unapologetic about the need for equity and justice. You know what I mean? And so I think that's maybe before people were a little bit hesitant to kind of enter into that, and certainly from a scientific standpoint of seeming unobjective or whatever. And I think nowadays, even though we always obviously strive to have our methods be, objective and sound and just state of the art, really, we are unapologetic in our desire to have oceans that benefit everyone equitably, right? And so I think that's kind of the perspective that I take, and that I'm lucky enough to be able to do with the people that I work with.
That's great. No, that's a really good way to set the conversation. And I love the idea of a transformation in this industry. And again, 2020 has created a disruption, which is sometimes needed for a transformation. So thanks for thinking about it in that way. Julie, I want to go back to you. You mentioned this, and obviously this is what SAGE is working on, but can you talk a little bit more about the importance of gender equality in the seafood industry and how this impacts or relates to business and environmental outcomes?
Sure. So 50% of people in seafood production are women. So, and that, you know, mirrors the population. I think 50% of the population is women. So, however, it within a seafood supply chain, from a fishery or a farm all the way to the marketplace, women are concentrated specifically. The statistic I heard was 85% of people in the processing sector are women, and that's, you know, the majority of that. That's really where they're concentrated, and women are rarely in leadership positions and involved in discussions around the management of a fishery or farm. Even at the processing level, there's not many women in leadership on the floor, and this is globally. So, you know, you mentioned, you know, disruption and transforming the sector. I mean, we are in a place right now where decisions, and I've said this before, are being made in real time about the future of the industry, and not just seafood industry, but all industries probably. And if you don't have, you know, the diverse voices at the table making these decisions, helping, you know, contribute to solutions to solve these problems, then you are, I don't want to say bound to fail, but you're definitely not getting a full breadth and depth of solutions that could be potentially better for the future. So it's really critical in my mind, you know, coming up with these decisions and how we're going to shape the industry in the future, and not encouraging and gender diversity and gender equality is a mistake. And that's why SAGE was founded, was to kind of uplift, amplify, and integrate diverse voices, women's voices in global seafood production. So it's super critical if we want to, you know, have these diverse solutions to include all voices.
That's so important, and really relative, again, with the idea of not building back to the status quo. That also means adding voices and having equity when you have these conversations to build back.
And I would say that the global seafood, I would add that the global seafood kind of community, I guess, industry is also very white, not only very male, but also very white. So that's another, you know, it's different strategies, but something that someone else could, you know, really help to focus on as well, and bring solutions to not only the gender equality, but also diversity.
Right. Right. And we'll get into that, I think, a little bit later. Again, within the United States, there's an issue of diversity, but also thinking about voices from low and middle income countries, right? And really having them involved in the process. Marah, I want to ask you a question. Julie talked about the disruption in supply chains in particular. And in your bio, you said you've worked on the greening of supply chains. So I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit more, but really talk about, again, as I was saying, you know, how is this affecting small scale fishers, and what are you seeing in trends, and what's happening in the past and forward to today?
Right. No, it's a great question. And so we're at this, it's a really interesting moment. And I want to acknowledge that this has been an absolute crisis for a lot of communities. I'm going to focus on some of the opportunities and where we think we can move things, but I do want to acknowledge that there are people who are really hurting from this. And in fact, some of the work at Future Fish that we really pivoted to in March, and where some of our learnings have come from, has just been trying to help with basic, you know, protective gear and getting supplies into some of these more rural communities. So I think, you know, if we take a step back and we look at the global sustainable seafood movement, and I use quotes because, again, we talk about the global seafood supply chain and it's as if it's like one thing, and it is such a complex beast. And whether you're talking about aquaculture, wild capture, and then of course, industrial versus small scale. So my comments really do reflect more small scale. And in particular with Future Fish, we focus on Latin American communities and fisheries. So just want to make that clear. And I know there's some expertise on the panel that can weigh in on other areas, and probably also from the participants. So, but that all said, on a global level, we have made progress. You know, there are, I think it's about 35% by volume of the world's fisheries are now ranked, certified, or in some process of improvement. That's positive. That's huge. We have things like the Monterey Framework for Social Responsibility, which Andres was an author on the original paper that put that framework together. This trying to, again, talk about the need to pay attention to social responsibility as part of sustainability efforts, so that the movement really has started to grow. All of this, I think, is really positive. But COVID's also helped highlight some of the weaknesses and exacerbate some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that we've seen. So in many small scale fisheries, there has been progress on the environmental side and even on the social side in communities being able to connect to more lucrative export markets that have benefited from higher prices. And what we see now is that that strategy, while it did bring more value into some of these communities, it has made them dependent on those export markets. And of course, with something like COVID happening, you have those export markets now not secure or really volatile. Very uncertain. We've also known that there's a, inequity in terms of the actual food value. Folks fishing and no longer keeping the fish locally, but selling it abroad. So as COVID has sort of rippled through, we're seeing now a sense of open-mindedness, I would say, a sense of willingness maybe to engage in some solutions that have been on the table for a while, at least with the communities we're working in. Sorry, it's telling me my son's school is starting, apologies. So it's looking at things like using shorter supply chains. So having communities being willing to experiment with new market channels, potentially new product forms that serve more local or regional markets. We're seeing adoption of technology. So the use of just simple platforms, WhatsApp, Facebook, for fishers to connect more directly with buyers has been a big movement, and selling just to their neighbors. And then there's some more sophisticated platforms that are sort of emerging out of that. These are things that have been around, but again, when things are going okay and everybody's comfortable, it's, there's not a fear, but, a hesitancy to rock the boat, if you will, for bad fish puns to come in. But now I think there's that sense of, why not? Why not reinvent? Why not try some of these things? And so I think there really is an opportunity to work with that sense of engagement and greater willingness to try some new things. Of course, that needs to be done in a way where also there are safety nets, right? So that as we're working with these communities, and especially with what we call the first mile, so the producers, the fishers, the small processors, or folks who receive that first product, that we are building these solutions and interventions in ways that if they should fail, if they don't work, that burden does not fall on those individuals alone, that it's shared, again, through the supply chains, it's shared through the communities, the multi-stakeholder community that we're trying to build in these places. But I think, we've seen good progress. We see an opportunity with COVID, and, the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions is a big group of NGOs and now actually industry in environmental and social spheres that are working on these problems. They just had their conference last week. And one thing that was noted is, the new sort of milestone that we're trying to hit is 75% of seafood certified, rated, or in an improvement project by 2030. That is a huge goal, and it absolutely cannot happen if we are not engaging in some of, I would say, kind of the trickier or more gnarly fisheries, and those involve small scale communities where it's some of these same market levers aren't going to work in the same way. And so we really do need to kind of roll up our sleeves and dig in. And I think some of the folks on this panel are bringing, along, hopefully with us at Future Fish, these different ways of approaching the problem that really are thinking about that integrated approach, which is so necessary.
That's great. It really is interesting to first recognize the situation and people being creative and out of necessity to make those changes. Yeah. And Marah, can you also just give context? Are you seeing this? I know Future Fish works in Peru. Are you seeing this in Peru or in other countries, or where are you seeing it?
Yeah, so we're seeing it certainly in the fisheries where we work in Peru, also in Chile where we've been active. We actually saw a pretty big acceleration of a mid supply chain solution. So the fishers working closely with the vendors at these open air markets, that was something we'd been working on already, but it really helped kind of ramp up that communication and some of those pathways for change and for new interventions, including looking at a new middle distributor that we're working to develop that is focused on equity and environmental principles. But from colleagues in this space, again, especially last week, it was great because we got to kind of hear from everybody. I think this is something that we're seeing pick up around the globe. There's a technology social enterprise called Abelobi in South Africa that have marketplace platforms for fishers to connect with. They're seeing some really interesting movement. So yeah, there's I think a lot happening just around the world in terms of this response. But again, in order to take advantage of that, we need to make sure at that very basic level for individuals and communities that people are empowered, that they have the capacity to engage, right. That they, and Julie mentioned, have a seat at the table. And we heard this wonderful talk by a gentleman named Junius Williams on diversity and equity. And he was saying, you know, inclusion isn't enough. Inclusion means you're showing up at a table that's already been built. What we need to do is make sure everybody is actually building that table. And that's what I think this time allows for, is how can we take this step back and say, as we think about these solutions, having that diversity of voices, the gender equity piece, the low income, middle income, the different ethnic groups that are part of fisheries. How do we make sure everybody is getting a seat? Indigenous groups, as you said, really, really critical. And it's not always easy. It takes a lot of effort to find individuals and to do that relationship building and to build the trust. And I think that's a place where we really need to think about, what does that look like, and how do we support and bring resources into that piece of the problem solving, as much as bringing in some of the ideas around what a supply chain solution can look like, or what a new product form or things like that can look like. So it's a lot to piece together, but I think we need to do all of it simultaneously so that we're really building that foundation that's going to lead to that better future.
I love that, building the table instead of inviting someone to the table, really building it together, co-creating something for the future. That's really great. Andres, Marah talked about some good progress that's been made recently and some of these opportunities, but can you, from your, again, resource economist background, really looking at the cost benefit of all of this, can you tell us a little bit more about the challenges and opportunities that we need to think about moving forward?
Are you setting me up to be a pessimist?
No, I said opportunities too. Opportunities. Just an economist. Both.
No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I think it's really important, and I'm not actually playing the pessimist role, but it is important to be realistic in terms of the costs and benefits of these things, right? That being said, though, I think one way forward that to me is very interesting, and I think more people are sort of coming along with this way of thinking, is the fact that, for so long we've been trying to, anybody who's taken an economics class, right? It's like, oh, the markets and that sort of thing. And we've been trying to kind of to fit the world in that very narrow set of very particular assumptions, right? Because economics, if you remember your 101s, is not really about money. It's not about finances. It's about allocation of scarce resources among competing wants, right? Or something like that, you must have learned. And so I think we're sort of that laser focus of economics and economists on, profitability, efficiency, all that sort of thing. That is a subset of the field, but at some point it just became like the thing to do, the only thing to do. And so again, I think for a long time, I've been trying to fit the world into that very narrow worldview and kind of disciplinary view. And more we're just recognizing that, hey, listen, we've got so many tools in economics, and again, obviously in other disciplines, but I'm speaking as an economist, we have so many tools in economics that can allow us to better understand these things, and to really recognize the not just the differences of incentives that people have, which again in economics is a very important thing to recognize. This asymmetric or non-aligning incentives between different groups of stakeholders or even individuals within the same group, because people aren't, there aren't these monolithic groups out there. And so I think that's going to be the key moving forward. And I remember, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but if you ever heard of like input-output analysis, basically anytime you hear about GDPs and how much X industry contributes to the economy, there's an input-output analysis behind that. And so the guy that won the Nobel for that, Vasily Leontief, I think this is back in the 50s, his driving force for actually creating the methodology that we use for this was that he said, listen, we've gathered all of this data and we have no way to analyze it. And so he said something like, we've come to a point where we have a bunch of models with no data to support them and a bunch of data with no models to explain it, right? And so I think we're kind of at that point now in a lot of these ocean systems where we recognize that the models we've been using before just don't work. And not only do they not work, they can be counterproductive. And we need to just find a way to actually change our way of thinking and change our models to better fit the realities on the ground and not the other way around, right? I mean, I think Julie made some really, really important points about the role of gender in fisheries specifically, but also in a lot of other informal sectors of the economy. And I think that informal economy is enormous, and we can't continue to create all these economic models and economic policies ignoring that. I know for Mexico in particular, right now under COVID, which Marah kind of touched on, is, obviously shrouding everything. Like I'm in my garage because of COVID, and I'm freezing actually. In Mexico, where I'm from, for example, 60% of the economy is informal. 60%. And so these are people that they can't work on a computer. They can't stay at home, or in many cases, or actually all cases, they don't have access to any sort of like safety net or income supplement or anything, even if there were some, which they're not because we're also broke, but that's besides COVID in Mexico. But that happens all the time in fisheries specifically, in ocean sectors, right? So again, this is kind of this idea of COVID, laying bare all these different lacks of safety nets and weaknesses in our whole system, right? And so I think now what's going to be really interesting, and again, Marah, I totally echo your point. I mean, we have to recognize that people are really, really hurting right now. So when we talk about opportunities of COVID and stuff, like we're not being callous or dismissive of that aspect of it. But the fact is we do need to rebuild. We will need to rebuild these things. And so in so doing, I think from an economic standpoint, the most important thing that we can do is to make sure that we're thinking of new models that better fit the realities on the ground. And so I think something that we have done okay in the past is use relatively basic methods, but to shine light on incredibly important subjects. So to give you an example, one work that I was involved in a couple of years ago was estimating the yearly seafood consumption of indigenous peoples all around the world, right? And so this was seen as something, I'm not an indigenous scholar or a scholar of indigeneity, but I do work with many of them. And it seems like, listen, if we had some way to just give a sense of scale to these people, right, and to their needs, it would be incredibly useful to people that are working in that field. And so that's somewhere where I can come in from a quantitative standpoint and really do things right, being advised and working very closely together with anthropologists and people that know these issues much better than I do. And so that was incredibly successful, right, in terms of giving them that platform. And, ideally, we would live in a world where you don't need a big number to have people care about vulnerable people. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world. And that sort of exercise is incredibly useful. We've seen similar things for, calculating there's a lot of recent studies, for example, on women specifically in fisheries, calculating their contribution, both in terms of not just occupation, but also economic impacts of that sector of the workforce. This all comes, I love where Julie was coming from. I think a lot of it has come up is from the natural sciences. So a lot of this came from, estimating the amount of bycatch that goes uncounted, or discards or illegal fishing. And so slowly but surely, we're trying to do similar methods to these social issues that I believe are really underlying everything. So I think that's been a big realization of a lot of us that move from the natural sciences to maybe economics and quantitative to more policy, more directly applied policy problems. The fact that a lot of these issues aren't biology, and we were saying the other way, we can spin our wheels for the next 30 years on why we don't achieve maximum sustainable yield, or, we're not exactly respecting the minimum sizes or whatever, which are incredibly important. I don't want to minimize that. Like that's the target that we want to get to. But the reason why we're not getting to it is the social aspect, the cultural aspects, and we should always ask ourselves, wait a minute, like why don't people want to comply with X regulation? There can be a million different reasons for that. So maybe they don't have the equipment to do it. Maybe they don't even know about the regulation because they've never met a fisheries officer. Maybe there is organized crime in these communities, which unfortunately is the case in Latin America, where I'm from, and many other parts of the world where I've been. And that can be named cartel. It can be named a local a cacique, like not a warlord, but like local power people. And it can take many different forms. But that's why that complexity is so important. That's why we need to lean on the social scientists, lean on the people that are working on the ground, talk to people in the community, because even though many of these problems are incredibly similar across the world, again, the underlying causes can be super, super complex and really, really different.
That's such a great way to explain it, and probably the most comprehensive social science answer I've ever heard from an economist. So thank you.
You know what? I've talked to a lot of social scientists, so it's ingrained. It's in me now.
Great.
I love it.
No, it's really great. I mean, and again, bringing the data to life, really, and understanding these complex problems. And what I learned recently too, just in the seafood industry, just there's such thin margins normally. And now with COVID and just everything going on, it's been really devastating. So it's just really important, like you said, to think about all these aspects from kind of a cost benefit view, but then also look at the complexity underneath. So thank you for that. This is really interesting to me. So I'm going to give one or two more questions to the panelists and then open it up for you all in the audience to ask questions too. So you can think about your questions, go ahead and you can start putting them in the Q&A tab if you find that at the bottom of your screen. Type it in there, and then we'll open it up to you all for questions as well. Julie, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to go the same question for all of the panelists. This has been a great mix of looking at this issue from both, again, challenges and opportunities, but I really want to think about the future now and really ask all of you if you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future, and more in the sense that because these are such complex issues, how do we prioritize? Again, this can't change overnight. This is going to take a very long time for this to really improve. So Julie, can you tell us a little bit, are you optimistic about the future, or where do you think we should go from here?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I am personally a very optimistic person. So I'm really trying hard to remain such. And I do, we have mentioned several times here that they're acknowledging the extreme difficulties that have, come up because of COVID, but also we recognize that there are extreme opportunities. And Marah mentioned the measurement that we are all working under we've accomplished so much, getting 35% of global seafood production either certified, rated, or in an improvement project. And so I wanted to say that that's really, the goal for the next 10 years is to get 75% of global seafood production into these rated, certified, or improvement projects. And so that's a huge goal. That's essentially more than doubling what we've accomplished over 20 years in half that time. So by 2030. So that's the goal for the sustainable seafood movement. And so the working theory behind SAGE is that we're going to have to attack that goal from a different angle. And I know this discussion is around SDG 14, but I'm, very focused on SDG 5, as you can see from my Twitter handle, SDG 5 for seafood. Follow me on Twitter. But the theory is that SDG 5, gender equality, it's not a theory, it's true. It's indivisible of all of the other SDGs. And so you can't take that out of the equation. And it's also a scalar and an enabler and an accelerator of the other SDGs. So why don't we continue to do what we can for SDG 14, life below water, but bring in this additional kind of filter or lens or whatever you want to call it, effort through the gender equality SDG 5 to get to our goals with SDG 14. So that's the working theory behind SAGE specifically. And I do think, I wanted to say one more, I got another statistic here I'm going to throw out. I read relatively recently that pre-COVID, the World Economic Forum predicted that it would take 257 years to reach economic parity between men and women globally. This is pre-COVID. So you can imagine that has been set back even further because of what we're happening. I mean, there wasn't a quote, but I heard about roughly a generation. So that's another 25 years. So put on there 257 plus 25. So this is really not great. And so while I am extremely optimistic because I know the talent and the brains and the just sheer goodwill and enthusiasm behind solving these issues globally, it's a tough lift. So I want to be tempered in my enthusiasm and optimism, but I am optimistic. That was a long way to say I'm cautiously optimistic.
Right. No, that's good. And I imagine you all can't be in this work unless you're optimistic. I mean, it's hard work. So,
it is,
but thank you for being honest that the challenges are immense. And I love your reference to other SDGs. At Global Washington, we're really thinking about this cross-cutting issues of the SDGs. And one theme that's really emerged too is this idea of feminist leadership. And again, it is a women-centered approach to programs, but it's also just having a feminist approach as a philosophy. So leadership and decision-making, men can be feminists too, right?
Sure,
and just the whole idea of having a feminist approach to programs and strategies. So
and I would echo, gender equality isn't just about women's empowerment. It's about men as well, and anyone on the spectrum, right, of gender. And, when I think about it in fisheries, I think about this a lot, like how can we, we're looking at human rights issues in fisheries, right? And distant fleet fisheries where men can be kidnapped and forced into labor on boats for years without even seeing land. And so how can, supporting gender equality and really, and supporting the communities and getting more diverse leadership into, and women's leadership in there too, how can that potentially solve some of these issues where men are putting themselves in vulnerable positions to look for work and thereby being kidnapped and put on these boats? So it's definitely intersectional within that, but also across the board. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's such an important issue. And I mean, it reminds me, Vulcan Productions based in Seattle created a fantastic documentary called Ghost Ship, I believe, that was about Ghost Fleet. Thank you. About this very issue. So incredibly important. Thank you. Marah, I'm going to go to you next. What are you thinking for the future? Are you optimistic? And again, how should we think about prioritizing in the future?
Yeah, thanks. I can definitely echo Julie. My background's in coral reef ecology, and we say that for sure, if you're going to study coral reefs, you have to be an optimist, as one of the just sort of the foundations. But I think I like to say I'm a realistic optimist, right? So part of that is that I truly believe in human ingenuity and innovation. I don't think we can put a limit to what we can solve for. Whether or not we can apply it in time is where the realism comes in. But I think something that we're looking at a lot at Future of Fish is this, actually starting in 2021, it's the decade of the ocean. So I think it's decade of ocean science for sustainable development is under the UN. So, and I really like this idea of, and where we're thinking a lot is sustainable development, but in the context of there's a lot of momentum around the blue economy in general, right? There's new technologies, there's new innovations, all that are allowing us to access the oceans in ways that we haven't before. And of course, there's huge risk there. We have to be careful about how that's done. But part of where I think a lot of opportunity lies is to be looking at small scale fishing communities and coastal communities as the leaders and the centers of innovation, technology, practice in building out what the future of a sustainable blue economy can look like. And fishing is part of that. Wild capture is part of that, traditional ways as well as modern ways, but it's part. And so I think a huge opportunity is for us, again, who work on especially small scale fisheries, is to say, how can we open up this lens, which of course it can make the problem bigger, can make it a little messier before you then can hone in. But in some of these cases, we know effort needs to get off the water. There's just no question. There's too much fishing going on and not enough fish left. So how do we build and take advantage of some of this momentum in the blue economy and in really holistic development of opportunity in these places? I think that offers a very different approach and a very promising one. Again, there are risks. We've got to manage for those and mitigate for that. But especially when then layering things like resilience to climate change and to global shocks like COVID, the more diverse we can have some of these economies, the more we can keep the wealth of that natural resource locally grounded while sharing, kind of moving out in concentric circles. I think the better in terms of the long-term health and ability to really lift up local while still providing food for the planet. So to me, it's about that integration. It's about thinking of fisheries as part of sustainable blue economy development. And again, putting the groundwork in place so that these communities, these coastal communities, are empowered to act through having the knowledge, through having the access, through having the seat at the table, and through having the opportunities be grounded there. How does the knowledge economy come there? How does the technology and innovation economy come there and be able to support that growth? And how does the future of wild fisheries become part of the future of food systems of our planet that first support food security and then are seen as a commercial activity for trade? To me, that flip also needs to be created. And I think we have a good start. I really do. I think a lot of these solutions and ideas are there. It's putting them into practice. And that is going to take different kinds of financing and very, very patient support, long-term patient reserves for the groundwork of that relationship building, trust building, lots of community meetings, which is hard, especially as a nonprofit. To be honest, that's not delivering necessarily sexy statistics on progress, right? Metrics on actually moving things forward, but it is hugely important. So figuring out how we can get the resources to do that work, to bring together those multi-stakeholder conversations and build that trust, I think is another place where we can be looking to really focus.
That's great. That sounds optimistic to me. That sounds really great. But again, yeah, like you said, a realistic view of the challenges. So Thank you. Andres, how are you thinking about the future these days?
Thanks. I mean, I also I'm definitely an optimist. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to be realistic about the things they need to face, right? I think there are some things that cautiously more optimistic of. So, for example, SDG 14.6, which is ending harmful fishery subsidies. The deadline for that is coming up in December. That's something I've been working really closely with, sort of behind the scenes, and it seems to be going okay. Like there seems to be a chance that it's going to happen, right? I mean, that's definitely not 100% because we're talking about.
Are you giving us an inside scoop
no,
on that?
No.
I'm following that closely as well.
I think the only inside scoop that I can confidently give is that it hasn't fully broken down, which is good in terms of like international negotiations. Like there's progress, right? And so I'm cautiously optimistic about that. As for those of you who don't know, it's kind of a ridiculously low bar, but anyway, it is what it is. So this agreement is to end harmful fishery subsidies, which basically means government subsidies for illegal fishing, overfishing, and overcapacity, which is just like when you don't have enough fish left and you're putting in bigger boats, kind of thing, right? So again, pretty low bar, but it's progress, right? And it's progress. And I think something that I've been a really vocal supporter of is that we have to see this as an opportunity, because I think the spin on this sort of agreement, like any sort of environmental regulation, although this is more of an economic regulation, has been that it's going to harm communities, right? It's like, oh, why don't you want to support communities? But we have to really get away from that and say, listen, these are supports that we know are not helping. They're inefficient economically. They're contributing to overfishing. Here's a stat for you. We already mentioned that artisanal fisheries contribute 90% of work in the oceans, and 50% of food for human consumption, right? And yet for every dollar of support that they get, industrial fishing gets $7, right? So I think it's something like 86% of all the subsidies that are given to industrial fleets. So again, this is a type of policy that is contributing not just to the overfishing and is inefficient, but to inequality, right? Because it allows these sort of power imbalances to continue. And so again, I kind of look for those little policy windows of opportunity that open up every once in a while. So again, this 14.6, ending harmful fishery subsidies is one. The UN Decade of the Ocean, which we mentioned, is another one that's opening up in January. And if anybody's interested, they've got their voluntary commitments up, so you can actually register a commitment that you have to support this, and they can review it and make it part of the, just part of this whole effort. And there's others like it, right? I mean, the SDGs in general are one. There's different negotiations right now in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So these are the high seas, the deep sea, where there's a lot of interest because of mineral exploitation, but there's also a huge amount of risk, like Marah mentioned. And so sort of enveloping all of that, I think the most important thing is that we center equity and human well-being within anything. Because Julie touched on this. One really amazing part of working in this space is that there's so many bright people working on these things from so many different perspectives, right? And so I've been really lucky with Ocean Nexus because we're interdisciplinary to get a sense of that. But anybody who's working in oceans has experienced that, right? And we've seen, really incredible efforts. There's a Too Big to Ignore project that focuses, there's a global network, people focusing on artisanal fishing. And so again, this is very much bottom up. There's Global Fishing Watch, which is this new technology that essentially captures the pings from different boats, and it lets you see fishing activity in real time. Right. So again, this is as top down as you can get, right? There's satellites looking down. There's a whole bunch of legal scholars looking at the ins and outs of these different policy negotiations. But one thing we have to be really mindful of is that any solution can be counterproductive if you don't do it right. So you might have the right idea, but it's all about the implementation. And so I think that's why if you always sort of begin the conversation with, how is this going to impact equity? You know, whether or not you think it might or not, you need to think about it at the start, right? And if you're not really sure, reach out to someone who you think might know and give you some advice, right? And so I think that's really the key. And that's why I'm optimistic, because I think there is a lot more openness to that. And I think as people start to do this more and more, we'll get these different efforts, again, very different perspectives, potentially different assumptions, but we'll all kind of trend in the same direction, which I think we all want, you know, which is human well-being, sort of equitable outcomes across the board. Julie made a great point on the feminism aspect. This is about human rights, you know, and there are groups that have not had those same rights as other groups, right? So it's not about putting one group over the other. It's about everybody coming together, right? And so Marah mentioned the Monterey Framework. Normally we think about fisheries and we think about, oh, food or whatever, but the Monterey Framework, that's actually kind of, it's really important, but that's the third principle, right? The first one is human rights, like ensure that human rights are being respected. That's just the basic thing that we need to achieve, right? After that, it's, you know, the equitable and opportunities to benefit from these different things. That's after the table's been built, right? We want people to build that table. After it's built, then we get everybody in together, make sure that we're sharing equitably. And then the last part of it is, all right, how do we then produce food and produce sustainable livelihoods? So I'm optimistic. I think I've been so astounded by the level of support that people have for this thing, you know, the level of commitment that people have for like equity and well-being. Again, whether you're a programmer or an economist or someone working on the ground. And I just think it's important that we all sort of are working towards that same objective.
That's so great. And thanks for, again, emphasizing centering equity and some of the policies coming out, the ending subsidies. It reminds me in Seattle and other cities, they closed down the streets, you know, for these healthy streets walking during COVID, for the lockdowns. And now some of these streets are going to be permanently healthy streets. And it's like, again, there's a moment that there can be policies that come forward that do the right thing in this moment of time. And it's great. And because in the past, it might be a lack of political will. And now, again, things have changed. And 2020 has just changed the way things are being approached. So that's great. That's great that there's some optimism in the policy front as well. So this is really good. I'm open to getting questions from the audience. Again, type it in the Q&A if you have any questions or comments. And I'm going to start with a couple, though, that have come up in my head throughout this conversation. I think I'll start with Marah on this. Again, if you could walk us through a little bit of the supply chain. Again, you've all talked about the difference between small scale fishers and large commercial, but can you talk about it in a way also of what is the role of nonprofits versus maybe even an off-taker in terms of the supply chain, right? How can nonprofits help in creating an ethical supply chain, and how do how does the private sector and commercial fishery and even people buying the large scale or even small scale fish to sell them in the United States, how does this all fit together? How should it fit together? So Marah, I'll start with you.
Oh, this is a tough one. This is a really tough one. But it's a great question. And I think it's a perpetual question that we need to be asking. So for a little bit of history, for those not familiar, there's been a lot of work and a lot of success, again, coming out of the last 20 years of engagement with big buyers. So retail partnerships where NGOs have directly engaged with that part of the supply chain to work on sustainability commitments and to get companies to say, we will only source from fisheries that have been rated or certified or are in an improvement project. And especially in North America and Europe, many of the large buyers are working with NGOs, have made these commitments. There are also NGOs that have been targeting the mid-supply chain companies. And there's been a lot of work on trying to align those asks and making sure there's consistency. There's some great work. There's a whole seafood ratings and certifications group that are making sure that there's alignment there, to provide incentive and a pathway for industry to take action here. As part of that work, as both Julie and Andres have been participants of and spoke to, there's also now movement to say, how do we embed social responsibility into these same commitments? The Monterey Framework is now, as we speak, being incorporated into things like fishery improvement projects, so that we can't say you're environmentally sustainable if you have egregious human rights, violations happening. But also, again, it's the three pillars. Is there equal access to opportunity there? And I know I'm seeing Juno's on the call and others who've been really spearheading that work. And it's so, so critical. So I think there are, through business commitments and through engagement with NGOs, the industry has started to shift, buying practices. And that, you can think of that as kind of a top-down approach, right? It's using the market and trying to get those market forces to help push change down. Part of where that's gotten tricky is that global seafood supply chains are just incredibly fragmented. They are so diverse and split and opaque, and it is really, really hard to get that sort of domino effect to really happen. And so there are other efforts that are happening, I think, and again, industry plays a role, NGOs play a role, local governments play a big role in trying to sort of work from the bottom up. And I think that's really where some of the innovation and some of the focus is starting to turn, especially when it comes to small scale fisheries, because again, part of the solution has been helping local communities to improve quality, to meet standards for export markets that can reward that best practice through a better price or a certification or something that gives more market access. That still is a great part of the solution. But I think what we've seen is we went really heavy there, right? It was almost like putting all your eggs in one basket. And so the other question is, again, how can we start to develop more local and regional markets that can pay a fair price, that where the seafood is affordable? Getting rid of the subsidies is a huge part of this. What Andres was talking about, because what happens is you skew what the cost of seafood actually is, and you can't put it you could redirect those resources to making the food more accessible and at realistic costs versus just getting the prices down so that we can, basically rape and pillage the oceans. So we need to really look at what that restructuring looks like. And I think the work of Andres and other economists is really critical there, so that people can afford to buy the seafood that's caught and fishers can afford to fish and earn a sustainable livelihood. But again, this is where I think alternative or supplemental income solutions are really important. And a huge piece of that, I think, can also be, again, where NGOs can come in, is around conservation-based outcomes, right? So how do local communities get rewarded for preserving, protecting, and restoring and rebuilding the natural resources that are local to them in their communities and in their coastlines? What are the ways that, what are the values that can be put there that can help support fishing communities to not have to fish as much? How does that get baked into the portfolio? So I think there's a lot that NGOs are trying to do through partnerships with industries, but also partnerships with communities. There's also a lot of work around with governments. In many places, governments locally and federally or nationally just do not have fisheries science and management and certainly enforcement capacity. They just don't. And so what do we do? What's the role of co-management? How much can communities be taking on some of that? Where then does your verification come in? And I think all of that still needs to be sorted out. And both industry and NGOs have an important role to play there in terms of what that looks like, and should both play a role. So yeah, I think there's a lot of space for that to happen. But I think, again, it all starts with empowerment, I think, of the communities and some of the smaller entities, fisher associations, anchor firms that are locally based in the supply chain who can be more robust and become the industry advocates for greater equity and environmental responsibility and social responsibility in their supply chains. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that was really good. And yeah, I'd love to have Julie and Andres answer the same question. And there's actually a related question from someone in the audience that is the same type of question around small scale fisheries. And it's so Julie and Andres, if you can weave this in too, is how do you see community managed small scale fisheries practices scaling up? And what are the gaps in the system that prevent widespread adoption? And what do you think nonprofits need to do to overcome this? Again, so if there's a role for nonprofits to help in the scaling as you think about the supply chain. But Julie, do you want to make a comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Marah said, and I don't even think I have anything to add because, that was a pretty comprehensive answer.
What do you think also just in the concept of scaling? I mean, is there an argument where there maybe is not a desire to scale and that maybe there is, I mean, Marah, you mentioned more regional markets, but is it aspirational for every small scale fisher to sell to Costco one day? Or, how do you think about scaling?
No, I don't think that should be the aspiration at all, actually. Marah mentioned Junius Williams and the seminar or the webinar that we were at last week. And he said, we shouldn't be importing anything from the US to other countries right now, especially during this time of great reckoning, I think. And, Marah, you mentioned certifications and ratings, and I think that's one of the dangers. I mean, prior to here, I was at Fair Trade USA, which is a certification. And I think there's a lot of criticism about certifications in terms of kind of a neo-colonial approach where we're going into these small, lower income communities and trying to, convince them to change their practices and to become, to access markets that care about sustainability. And it's, as Marah said, it's a great approach and it's a great tool, but there's other tools. And so I think when you're talking about small scale fisheries and the management, I think it's really important to understand A, what they think, and B, what they think would work best for them. And then how can we help facilitate that? And it doesn't have to scale necessarily. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Exactly. Now, again, it's this whole idea of really thinking about equity has to be with what is most appropriate for the local communities.
Right. And I mean, my key kind of request and ask is that we do have, that table. We talk about either sitting at the table or building the table. Right now, we're going to rebuild the table, right? So making sure that everybody who should be helping build that table is building the table, and women specifically in my case, like my request is that. So that's one way that actually we can potentially scale is through including more women in decision-making discussions and about management and the management of the fishery. And I think I said this before on the prior call is that, or in a prior discussion is that, there's a lot of discussion around co-designing solutions, and you can be co-designing a solution, but if you don't have women at the table, you're actually not co-designing the solution because women aren't there, and they're the ones that are doing a lot of the work, pre-harvest, post-harvest, harvest. So just make sure you have everyone at the table. And like Andreas, like you said, I wrote this down even, it's like, let me find it. It's, I think that, you're right, the question you need to ask first is how will this impact equity, whatever we do. So
that's great. Good. Andres, do you want to jump in on that too? Thinking about the supply chain and scaling and appropriate role for a nonprofit?
I mean, I don't work for a nonprofit, but I mean, I think you guys have got it spot on. We've talked a little about this before. And I think one thing that I think has to be recognized is that nonprofits, whether they're the large international or local nonprofits, I think have really learned a lot from some of the mistakes that were made in the past. I touched on this before. I mean, I think, I told you guys one of my early memories was my dad coming home and in consternation because a large international conservation NGO was wanting to kind of shut down all the fisheries in the part of Mexico where we're from. And that didn't eventually go through. But certainly some of the large MPAs that were put in around Mexico, and this has occurred in other parts of the world, were incredibly impactful and harmful to local fishing communities. And I think that, people didn't respect them because, as Marah said, there is no enforcement capacity, right? So people don't want to do it, they just don't. But B, more importantly, I think it caused a huge amount of distrust that took 20, 30 years to repair, right? And so, but that being said, I do think that a lot of NGOs have come a long way in really thinking more carefully about how they're doing these things, and I don't think we're quite there yet. I might love Julie's thing about this building the table thing. I'm going to steal that, Julie. I'm just telling you right now. From now on, I think.
I don't think I came up with it, but go ahead.
Oh, really? Well, I'll give you credit anyway.
Okay.
But I think still we're a little bit at the point where, for example, MPA is a really easy example because it's, one of our most common types of interventions. I think still, we're still at the point where there's a lot more effort in including people in the implementation stage of MPAs, but still not before, right? And then there's like, do you guys want an MPA kind of thing? Right? We're still not quite there yet in the building the table aspect, but we're making progress. And so yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of how we're going to continue to see these things. And one more thing that I think Julie touched on, but it really needs to be stressed, is that we need to look beyond the ocean. Like I love the ocean, I love fisheries and fishing, but we need to recognize that the biology isn't always the problem, and the community objectives can be really different than fisheries management objectives. I'll never forget my first paying job as a resource economist was in the border between Costa Rica and Panama, and my job was to go in and help them design this model and get the target reference point so they could maximize profit, right? And it wasn't until like day 3 or 4 that we were in there and just kind of chatting, playing dominoes with the guys after the workshop was over, that it came out that they really wanted like a clinic, like a health clinic. Like that was what the community wanted, but they were just kind of like, well, we didn't know if we should say anything because you guys were coming down here and doing all this stuff. It's like, oh well. No, yes, you should say something, and so the rest just turned out and mostly kind of helping them write this up and kind of, obviously I know nothing about the healthcare system in Costa Rica or Panama, but had to like contact other people who did know and try and see how we can help them in that way. And so, but I think that happens a lot still. And at the end of the day, sometimes you don't need an economist or a biologist or whatever. You need someone who knows about healthcare or someone who knows about, some other things. So we really need to look beyond that and just recognize that, even though we're coming at it from very much a natural capital sense, whether we like it or not, rebuilding the stocks and all this sort of thing, the community might want something different. And I think at the end of the day, it's their right to choose what those objectives and goals are for them.
Mm-hmm. That's great. No, a really good way to approach it. And again, I do think there has been a change in the broader global development community, both nonprofits and for-profit, of thinking about these things as community-led development rather than coming in with a solution, looking for a problem. But it's a challenge. We have another question from Marlene, who I think is a postdoc at World Fish, if I'm correct. But she wanted to pick up on Marah's comment about finance. And you talked a little bit about, she said, shorter value chains. And Marlene is seeing people talk about blended innovative finance. or for example, debt swaps to generate funds needed to rebuild after COVID. So she would like you to reflect on that and think about the equity challenges for relying on a blended finance and what that could bring in terms of uneven investment and enclosures for conservation. I will definitely punt some of this over to Andres as the economist on the panel. So I am a fish and coral scientist at my deepest expertise, but I can answer in part, and then I would love for other thoughts to come in. So blended finance, and I've been beat over the head by our blended finance director, Laura, who if she was on the call, I would just punt this to her. But it's an approach, right? It means combining different kinds of finance, especially around different types of risk tolerance. So, you can have grant-based that can take on a lot of risk. You can have impact investing, which tends to not want too much risk. And then you have really traditional financing, which has very, very, very little risk. And so in fisheries, that's the biggest thing is fisheries are risky. You can't see the resource. As much as we try to make these models solid, it's hard to know exactly what's there. It's an open access. So resource tenure is a huge issue in terms of how much control do you actually have over the natural resource on which your investment or capital is being based. So a lot of risk. And that's where this idea of blended finance comes in, is we know philanthropic and honestly seafood supply chain dollars will never be enough to create the transformation that we're all talking about here. This thinking bigger, thinking systemically, thinking more equity. So we need more financial resource to do that. But those bigger pots of financial resource, especially when you get into private capital, they can't handle the risk. So how do you make those two things meet? And there's a lot of work, and I really am not an expert enough to speak at a detailed level, but the part of what we're trying to do at Future of Fish, I can give an example, is how can you understand what the needs are of the fisheries and where some of that capital is needed for what kinds of activities and technical support? And then where is the money sitting? What kinds of pools of capital are there? And what are their risk frameworks? And then how can you try to start to build some bridges between the two by stacking different kinds of capital, reducing risk and things like that? We have a program, so we were working with a foundation in Chile. The goal is to create a loan platform where artisanal fishers can receive loans at a reasonable rate to make improvements. But the structure wasn't there. The actual tool wasn't there yet. So we work with this local institution that wants to create these loans. And the first thing we did was create a grant-based program, again, using philanthropic capital to start to onboard and be able to release some funds to the fishers and for them to start to test out what this financial tool could look like, with the hope that we're slowly going to build towards it becoming a more formal loan. So much of the financial and the risk piece goes back to Andreas's earlier point about so many fisheries being in the informal economy. It means they're excluded from the main financial systems that exist. Also in low income and middle income countries, you don't have government support systems. So again, I think part of the question was also like, how do we use some of the relief funds or the restructuring funds from COVID smartly? I think that, again, there needs to be really careful examination around what is the long-term goal. I love Andreas's filter of like, ask how this is going to impact equity, like do that homework, but then also ask around, there's some work in the US. Europe is taking the lead on a Green New Deal. There's work in the US to get that going, but there's also talk of a Blue New Deal. Like, how do the oceans play a role in that rebuilding, building back better and differently? And so again, I'll go back to the blue economy. How do we develop the infrastructure, whether that's cultural, market, physical, governance, the core infrastructure that's needed for us to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that well-managed, socially responsible,
ocean-based enterprise and innovation can create, and the food that comes from it and other products that come from it. That's the core. Design these relief programs with that new vision, not to put Band-Aid solutions, but to do the homework and build the foundations so that that brighter future can be realized, and can be realized in a reasonable time frame. So yeah, I was a little bit all over. Again, I'm going to pass it down down the line, but hopefully that's helpful.
That was really good, actually. You know more about it than you tend to believe. I think it was very good. And Andres, do you want to answer? I know finance is different than economics, but let us know what you think about this issue.
You know what? I'm lucky that I asked this question to a dear friend who works from the World Bank, and she was actually involved directly. And so I learned a lot about these debt swaps. And actually, Marlene is being not giving herself enough credit. Marlene Schluter has done a ton of work on these sorts of things in the Seychelles and in other places. So, so I guess first on the debt swaps, I think the main thing to remember, and this is what a lot of people kind of get wrong, and you guys have probably heard about this blue bonds initiative in the Seychelles. There's been talk about putting it in some other places, but really that's the only one that's actually been put in. And as Marah said, essentially what this does is if you have national debt, which most countries have, someone else is taking over that debt for you, right, at a lower interest, hopefully. In this particular case, the World Bank is the one that assumed that risk, right? So they kind of brokered the loan and said, listen, if anything happens, we'll back it. But this is still a loan, right? So this is not free money. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrong. It's like, oh, let's just do a blue bond and get this money. That's not what it is. It's just someone else is buying your mortgage, basically. And hopefully someone who will accept some different types of payments than a normal bank would, right? And so in this case, for most of the debt swaps that have been talked about, you also hear them kind of a debt for nature swaps. And so essentially, you know, they're loaning you this money so that you can invest it in some sort of conservation or sustainability actions, right? Now, the problem with this, though, is that, again, if the bank loans you money, they want money back, right? They just want their money with their interest, right? If someone else loans you money and they want something else that's not just money back, it still means they want something. And so one of the big risks of this thing is like, well, wait a minute, what is that something? Like, what am I committing to engaging in? And in many places, this is in the form of some sort of area conservation, whether it's an MPA or reserve or something like that. And so to go back to this filter, what often happens is this is national debt, right? So this is federal, or maybe not federal, but like national government objectives and goals. Those may not align with the goals of the local community, right? So from a national standpoint, it might be great to close off a whole area of the coastline, but for the people living there, maybe not so great, right? And so, but again, this is why they got this money. So there is a huge amount of pressure to actually get it through, you know? So I think that's what we always need to remember with these sorts of things, right? It's not free money, and if you're committing to giving something up. Now, the important thing in this, same with the payments for ecosystem services, any of these sorts of things that are kind of similar, right? Blue carbon markets. It's one thing when you create those incentives and these markets are self-sustaining, but Julie made this point, when this depends on other sources of funding, when that funding runs out, you better have a plan, right? Because otherwise the community is just going to go back to doing whatever else they were doing, you know, and worse, it can erode the trust again and say, hey, well, wait a minute, you promised us that we were going to have this, you know, money from whatever, conserving the mangrove, and now it's dried up. So now what? And so I think always we need to just really strive and do everything we can to find, we've touched on this before, locally sustainable markets, right? We can't depend always on these international markets. And of course they're great, right? You want that foreign income to come in. You know, that's what every country is kind of aspiring to, but the local markets need to be sustainable. And blue economy, Marah, I love, the way you put it. I think I've been working a lot in this blue economy space and theme. And I think the most important thing is to recognize that where we need the investments isn't in finding the resources. Private firms will do that. If there's a market for it, they'll find them and they'll map them. That's not where we need the work. Where we need the investment is making sure that when we develop something, it's going to develop equitably and sustainably, right? Because that part, the private world will not do by default, right? That's where they need to be pushed, right? And so I think that's spot on. So whenever we think about blue economy or blue growth or sustainable ocean economy, there's a lot of related terms for it. We need to think about those enabling conditions, right? So what are those conditions that are going to enable us to do this equitably and sustainably, and where the resources are and which ones they are, that's the easy part.
It's so great. I was going to jump in with another question, but I think we're coming to the end. And I just wanted to end of our time. And this has been fascinating. It definitely shows me in particular the complexity of the issue, and that, again, as Julie said, it's not just a life below water issue, it's a gender issue. And even Andre's saying that if you really look at the needs of the community, there's a health issue there. And obviously there's a nutrition issue there with health. And so there's so many cross-cutting issues here. And I feel optimistic knowing that all of you are working on this issue, because you all are not myopic. You really are thinking about these issues holistically, going back to Julie's term earlier. So I really wanted to thank you all for being on this panel. If you see in the chat, my colleague put in a link for our national forum. We would love for all of you listening in to join us at the National Forum to continue this conversation. We're going to have a session there on natural capital. And again, all this tension between centering equity and really thinking about how we create sustainable systems in the future. So it'd be great if you all could join, and we're actually offering a discount since you're here watching this. You can use that code to have a discount for the National Forum registration. And again, thank you for joining. We are recording this, so if you know people that couldn't join today, and I know this is a holiday week, we're going to be posting this on our YouTube channel for Global Washington. We'll send you all the link. Please share it with others. This is just such a valuable conversation that we want to get out to others who care about this. So with that, I'm just going to thank the panelists one more time, and thank you all for attending. And again, I hope you continue with your work you're doing, because we all need it in this world, in this 2020 and beyond. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks. This has been great.
Yeah.
Really appreciate the invitation.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you all. All right, take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah,
Good
you
health
too.
all.
Bye.
Bye.
Aloha.